Chapter 3. Canon of Fevers. After reaching Derry, the sky schooner fell into a holding pattern, circling the city in a wide arc. When they passed over a clearing, Brox, after reading up a bit more on controlling the airship, caused the sky schooner to land, dropping slowly onto a grassy field nestled in between numerous maple and oak trees. Several children from Derry had seen the airship and had come to investigate this unusual flying vessel. 4 kids, ages 6 to 13, appeared from the woods, walking single file with the oldest, a girl named Cinderhop, in the lead. They had anticipated seeing the sky schooner, but it had already shrunk down to its small size and had been put away by Brox. The children could hear the 2 little men speaking. "I cannot believe that we survived that." Brox's eyes remained wide with alarm. "We could have been eaten or fallen to our deaths." To be sure. A rustle of crunching grass blades caught their attention. "Looks like we have some visitors," said Brox, nodding toward the single file line of 4 children. "Hello, there," said Thistlethorn. The girl in the lead took a couple more steps and stopped. "Greetings to you, Sir Shortling." She made an imperial bow, the other 3 children following her lead. "And to you, too, Sir Gnome." Another imperial bow with the others following, again. "We came searching for the airship. A sky schooner, if I am correct. A very rare vessel." A puzzled look passed over Brox's face, followed by an expression of delight. He had been puzzled that such a youngster even knew that Thistlethorn was a shortling and that he was a gnome. Usually, the 2 talls referred to gnomes, shortlings, and halflings as dwarfs. Not only had she not called them dwarfs, she had known that the airship was a sky schooner. She proved very educated. "Well said, young lady. It was a sky schooner. I noticed that the sky schooner shuddered on the way down. I guess that your crystals are drained." The sky schooner had made a few minor jerks when in the holding pattern. These had become somewhat violent on the way down. "Intelligent and observant," replied Brox, nodding his head. "My name is Kin Bobby Brox, but I go by Brox. This is Thistlethorn." The 2 little men nodded sincerely. The gnome peered over his reading spectacles to get a better look at the other children. "And who might you all be?" Placing her hand on the shoulder of the youngest, the girl said, "This little one is my sister. Her name is Delava." She moved on. "These 2 are my cousins, Mick and Larn." She tipped her head to the right, forming a slight smile. "My name is Cinderhop. Good to make your acquaintance." "Likewise." For a moment, no one spoke. "Could you tell us," asked Thistlethorn, "which way to Cavington the Beheaded's bookshop?" As soon as he asked that, all of the children laughed, except Cinderhop. She asked, "Did you say Cavington the Beheaded?" "Yes." Thistlethorn observed the laughing children, especially the boy Mick, who looked like a shaking oak leaf caught in a sudden downburst. "I fail to see the humor of the question." "There is nothing wrong with your question. Most people think that Cavington the Beheaded is crazy, including these 3. Cinderhop's arm swept over the children, the sleeve of her yellow blouse ruffling in the wind. "I don't think that she is crazy, just eccentric." She shrugged. "We will gladly take you to Cavington the Beheaded." She turned and pointed to a wisp of a trail that disappeared behind a massive rock. "We can follow that. It goes by her place." Brox and Thistlethorn, led by the band of 4 children, kept in step along a dust-covered trail that passed through sharp barbs and patches of wedgwood flowers. Before long, after walking over a bridge that crossed an unnamed creek, they found themselves walking on a road made of wooden logs covered with creosote and gravel. The road had been named Jouster's Highway due to its history. Several centuries ago, 2 minor monarchies had started a feud over the boundary of their borders. To stop border skirmishes, a picket fence had been set up between the 2 monarchies. Both sides set patrols along the fence to keep the other side out. Since the fence stretched 1,000 furlongs in length, patrols took place on horseback. Although general battles waged by crossing the fence never occurred, jousting became a normal event. Patrols riding on either side would try to dismount the enemy with wooden lances. The Jousting caused major ruts to form in the ground due to the multitude of horses riding on either side of the fence. This, in turn, led to the construction of a good quality road for patrols to traverse. When the kings on the different sides died, their successors, both daughters, sued for peace, removed the fence, and made the jousters' highway. Shortly thereafter, Cinderhop and the other 3 children left the gnome and the shortling at the front door, or perhaps, it was the side door or the back door, no one could tell, of the lady's shop. Brox looked at the low, flat, symmetrically square house with a porch that ran all the way around it, not just along the front or one of the sides, but all 4 sides. On this exaggerated porch, there sat at least 100 rocking chairs all crammed together. Brox could tell that each was good for sitting in while reading, but as to why anyone would need so many rocking chairs, that puzzled him. Scattered around in the yard, there stood white gazebos, ivy-covered shelters, limestone fountains, wooden decks, and the like. All of these had rocking chairs designed for people to comfortably sit in while reading. Brox fancied a wooden deck that spiraled around, rising to a solitary, dark-stained pine rocking chair that rested under a burgundy canvas canopy. He figured that he liked it because it would be a good place to put a telescope at night after an evening of reading. Thistlethorn's attention riveted on a fountain sculpted in the shape of a titan, armed with a mighty maul, engaged in mortal combat with a coiled-up WYRM. The latter, instead of attacking with a breath weapon of fire, acid, or such, spewed forth a geyser of water from its maw, cascading over its foe. They both read a tarnished and slightly dented sign made out of copper nailed to the door. It said, Cavington's Emporium used books, old manuscripts, archaic tomes, venerable monographs, previously owned pamphlets, frayed treatises, second-hand documentaries, worn-out scrolls, superannuated codices, aged periodicals, hand-me-down journals, antique novels, antiquated novelettes. Below this sign hung a wooden sign that had ochre letters which said, Rebinding. Ripped pages mended. Scroll case replacements. Open dawn to dusk. Ring bell on desk for service. Help yourself to frangible crumb cakes and carve coffee. Have you ever been to this place? Asked Thistlethorn as he placed his hand on a black iron door handle. I've seen it from afar, but that's it. Turning the handle and pressing against the door, Thistlethorn led the way into Cavington's Emporium. The store consisted of 1 room plus a stairwell that led to a little basement. Everything consisted of hardwood, floor, ceiling, walls, tables, shelves, chairs, doors, window frames, desks, ladders, and so forth. Taking a few steps inside, they found themselves overwhelmed by the collection of books. The books filled the shelves with their spines facing outward in a meticulous array. Brox marveled at the polished wooden racks filled with scrolls, each perfectly set in its individual holder. Everything, whether a journal, novel, periodical, or other, rested neatly in its place. The two continued to look around at the thousands upon thousands of books, taking in the wonder of the vast amount of stories and knowledge that they represented. There are no customers here. Thistlethorn walked past a few shelves. As I am to understand, she often only gets 1 customer in a week. On a busy week, she will get 2. Well, both of us being here should be an avalanche of patrons. I wonder how she will react. Let's just hope that she has what we need. Brox pointed. Here she comes. Thistlethorn turned to see Cavington the Beheaded approaching from between 2 sets of shelves with books that dealt with forgotten kingdoms, forgotten wars, and forgotten relics. Doth mine eyes deceive me? What a roaring contingency of wee little men from afar with voices that split the slumber of a sleepy shop. Before Brox and Thistlethorn stood a woman in her 30s, sporting long brunette hair pulled back into a single braid of waist length. They both noted that she wore a khaki robe and a pair of brown boots that mimicked the style of dress from the novel-chained crypts and charnel catacombs. As for jewelry, she had a simple necklace with a charm that looked like a drop of water with silver dust in it. She held a reading stand, a portable device that she carried wherever she went so she could set a book on it. Although her appearance made her look out of touch with the rest of the world, her eyes flared with signs of imposing scholarship. Methinks, continued Cavington the Beheaded, as surely as the yellow hot sun blazes overhead in the midst of the noonday bright, that your weary selves do seek comfort after your lengthy travels. Make haste. Fetch yourselves to a chair of comfort, lay low your exhaustion, raise up your vigor of constitution. Brox and Thistlethorn glanced at each other as they took in her unusual style of speech. Burying herself in her countless books over the years had affected her mannerisms in a most peculiar way. That last speech of hers could have been summarized by simply saying, "You look tired. Have a seat." The two sat down in a pair of rocking chairs that swallowed them up. "Give report. Speak here. Utter forth. By the hand of whom were you guided to Cavington's Emporium?" "Cinderhop," replied Brox as he tried to get his rocking chair to rock. "Ah, yes, my niece, whose skill and knowledge of the lands lying round has brought you here." An expression of gratitude swept across her face as she spoke of the girl. Though she is not an Esne, thrall, or riot, she has toiled and moiled to make Cavington's Emporium look as picturesque as the moon rising behind the mountains on an autumn evening's elegance. The two little men nodded their heads, agreeing that the shop looked very presentable. "To what purpose have you travelled to my humble establishment?" I read 3 words via moonscript. Cavington the Beheaded's eyebrows immediately arched, from an old scroll. "We are seeking the meaning of the words." Brox cracked his jaw with his hand. "The 3 words are Doughty, Berwick, and Graben." Cavington the Beheaded, who had been standing, sat down in a rocking chair that did not have any arm rests. She mumbled the names and then became very quiet as she turned over in her mind where in her shop she could find something that mentioned those names. She mentally went through every book, codex, and tome that she had, sometimes making a motion as though pulling one of them off a shelf, opening it, and reading through the table of contents. When she thought of the pamphlets she had, she dismissed them almost out of hand because she only had 527 of those, and she had all of them memorized. She continued to dwell upon her inventory when she quietly departed for a moment. "She's an interesting character," noted Brox. "She talks like she belongs on a stage of some theatrical play." Thistlethorn hopped down from his rocking chair. "Let's try some of those frangible crumb cakes and carve coffee." They made their way over to a table that had the said food and drink sitting on glass-covered plates and in simmering coffee pots. After taking a frangible crumb cake and a cup of carved coffee each, they went outside to sit in 2 of the rocking chairs on a wooden deck nestled in a thicket of yellow-green shrubbery. Indeed, the frangible crumb cakes proved frangible, breaking into a multitude of pieces, leaving each of them covered with crumbs in dusty waves of wheat powder. Thistlethorn wondered if he even managed to eat half of his frangible crumb cake. The carved coffee tasted like twice grounded coffee beans flavored with a hint of coconut oil, an unusual blend, but quite flavorsome. The two pined the time away in silence, letting their weary bodies rest from their flight and their encounter with the giant. As they finished the last few drops of the carved coffee, Cavington the Beheaded appeared, walking up the steps of the wooden deck, carrying her bookstand in one hand and a basket in the other. They saw something in the basket, but neither of the two could tell what it was. Cavington the Beheaded set her bookstand down and stood there reading a novel titled Arcanum Striker. She had just started it moments before the other two had arrived. Now, she read the part where one of the story's main characters, a girl named Sterling, had been dumped on the floor of the Marilk Tower by a cyclops. A black knight, also known as Ilchar, Side of the Night, began to mock her. Despite her pleas of innocence, she ended up being cast into the pit of Forget-Me-Not. Cavington the Beheaded shuddered as she envisioned the lock snapping into place, sealing the girl in the darkness. Worse, she had read the story before and knew that the girl would soon encounter the Rhodia rats as they gnawed away at her flesh. Cavington the Beheaded snapped out of the surreal world of the novel that she had been reading and turned to the 2 customers who waited for her to say something. She spoke for a very long time, using a total of 986 words, by Thistlethorn's count, consisting of hyperboles, metaphors, similes, analogies, and, once, synonymous parallelism, better known as thought rhyme. In short, she said that she had resorted to using her personal copy of Yeoman's Cyclopedia of Uncommon Essentials, hard-to-find specifics, and supplementary of fine details to give her a lead as to where she might find something on the 3 mysterious words. Ultimately, this resulted in her locating a venerable monograph. She handed it to Brox. "The price is 17.5 gold crowns if you wish to purchase this exquisite work." She patted back a stray strand of her brunette hair. "Since you are a gnome and treasure books, I will wave the half-gold crown." After saying that, Cavington the Beheaded returned to her shop carrying her bookstand with Arcanum Striker on it and the now empty basket. After she left, Brox examined the monograph. It had a worn leather cover with a bitterly tarnished brass spine. A ragged leather strap wrapped around it. There existed a place on the front of the monograph that looked like it once held a buckle for the leather strap, but it had long since fallen off. The back of it had some runic words that neither Brox nor Thistlethorn understood. The front cover had a sharply detailed painting of a mausoleum on it, sitting in the midst of a graveyard with a tombstone, gravestone, and headstone next to the mausoleum. "Look at this," said Brox, pointing to a tombstone on the front cover. Thistlethorn stared at it, trying to read the name and the date. "I can't read the name or date on it," said the shortling, his eyes squinting. "It looks like the artist intentionally blurred those parts." No. Read what is written at the top of this and then the other two." Thistlethorn did so, letting out a low whistle in the process. He had been so focused on the names and dates that he had missed what was clearly written at the top of each of them. The first one said tombstone, the second headstone, and the last gravestone. A chill ran down his spine as he recalled the note that they had found in Brox's mailbox. An obvious connection. There appeared a flicker of fright in his eyes. Scary. The gnome gave a low nod of his head, sensing his own uncertainty and fear. He flipped through the monograph, noting that it consisted of a mere 61 pages, made from a heavy parchment. Even though the chapters were not labeled, the gnome noted an ornate woodcut on 8 of the pages, showing the start of each chapter. A few of the pages had monochrome drawings of solid quality. He only glanced at the pictures, before taking the time to study one of them in detail. It consisted of a manor on a hill, a servant's quarters, stables, a rooftop of a tool shed, and an archway that had the word Agewood lavishly written on it. Brox flipped through the monograph twice and then handed it to Thistlethorn. "Aren't you going to read it?" asked the shortling, taking the monograph. Brox simply pointed at the monograph. Thistlethorn opened it and could immediately see why Brox made no attempt to read it. "The whole thing is in the Canon of Fevers." Thistlethorn's voice sounded flat. "This could take days to translate." He slumped back in his rocking chair. One of the doors to Cavington's emporium opened, and the shop owner stepped out carrying her bookstand in one hand with its open book, reading it as she walked. Most people who read when they walk have to walk slowly. Cavington the Beheaded could move at any speed, including a full run, and read at the same time. In her other hand, she carried a small white marble statue of a scholar sitting in a high-back chair. The scholar wore a full-length robe and had a mortar board, with a tassel hanging off to the side, resting snugly on his head. When she stepped closer, Brox could see that the scholar had a monocle. She came up the steps of the wooden deck, still reading. When she reached the top, she put down her bookstand but read another 3 paragraphs before taking a break and speaking to the others. "This is a vernacular translator. It can read virtually any language and translate it for you. It does not read magic script. Some languages, such as Tasca, it does not understand, either." She sat the vernacular translator down on an end table between the 2 rocking chairs. She looked at Thistlethorn, the earlier stray strand of her hair hanging down in front of her forehead, impairing her vision slightly. "Just hand it the monograph when you are ready for it to read the text." Without explaining how an 18-inch statue could hold a monograph half its own height, she picked up her bookstand, started reading, and walked back to her shop. Brox shrugged. "Go ahead. Give the monograph to the statue." As Thistlethorn began to hand the monograph to the statue, it came alive of its own accord. The little marble man repositioned himself, smoothing his robe in the process, then reached up and took the monograph. As soon as his marble hands took hold of the monograph, it shrank down to a mere 2 inches in height, a normal size for him. He examined the monograph for a moment, examining its cover first and then flipping through the pages. "Canon of Fevers." A scowl crossed the minuscule marble face. "Are you emissaries of chaos?" "Not at all. Thistlethorn, caught completely off guard by the talking statue, responded with a shrill in his voice, making him sound unnecessarily guilty. "Humph," replied the marble statue. After saying that, the scholar pushed his tassel to the side and began to read, translating each word in the process. He did not read in the slow, typical process that most people did when reading aloud. He spoke with such fervor and speed that he reminded Brox of an auctioneer he once heard in village of balmy Dirtwood. The scholar spoke a generous 550 words per minute. He read a torrent of knowledge dealing with facts, dates, technical aspects of building constructions, and, as most of the text contained, the history of Doughty, Berwick, and Graben. Despite the rapid speaking of the scholar and the massive volume of information, Brox and Thistlethorn comprehended it all. The marble scholar finally finished the monograph and closed it. He looked at the back of the cover, adjusting his monocle twice. "The runes on the back are magical. I do not read any type of magic script." He handed the monograph back to Thistlethorn. After the shortling took the monograph, the marble scholar leaned back in his chair, folded his hands, and ceased to be animated. In the ensuing silence, Brox and Thistlethorn sat in a cold, lifeless stun, not wanting to believe what they just heard. The secrets revealed and their undeniable veracities threatened to overwhelm their mortal existence, snuffing them out from the sheer weight of the horror. Unexpected alarm and hopelessness raced over them like a waterfall, threatening to sink them, forcing them to drown. Both felt their own heart thrashing rapidly, hands shaking in trepidation, and their minds blaring a single line of thought: run, scuttle, dart, dash, lope, scamper, whatever it took to get away. A gruesome creature with a skull for a face waited to swallow them up and make them part of an undead army. Thistlethorn felt a deep, sulky, loathsome, unmasked foreboding. He recognized that the creature with the gruesome skull for a face was a Lick, a desperately fearsome foe. Brox knew instinctively that the Lick had discovered him and meant to find him, because Brox had seen the Forbidden Moon script, revealing the Licker's sinister kingdom. Doughty, Berwick, Graben. The gnome had inadvertently discovered forgotten names of ruins from the realm of an ancient, obscure civilization that ceased to exist over a millennium ago. They had long perished from the memories of men, being regulated to books of history. When those books had ceased to exist, they were passed on as legends and myths. Eventually, even those disappeared. The scholar had revealed that the individuals from that realm of ancient history had become overwhelmingly filled with the fear that their mortal existence would soon end. They pursued countless ways to extend the length of their lives, ultimately raising the lifespan of the population by a few years. If a person found a way to extend the lifespan by a month, the individual was hailed a hero. If one could extend it a full season, that person would be promoted to nobility. However, something happened to them. One night, they went to bed as usual. When they awoke, they found a viscous, icy, nearly opaque murkiness had rolled across the land. It remained there for a full lunar cycle. When the fog lifted, the inhabitants of the realm had changed. They left off their quest for long lives and started to build tombs, crypts, and mausoleums of immense size, ornate in detail, and of workmanship of immeasurable quality. Nevertheless, their generations were not forever. The people began to perish through wars, plagues, pestilence, and other disasters. Their kingdom fell and their work suffered with the passing of time under the ravaging elements of nature. After their demise as a nation, tomb raiders started to show up seeking diverse treasures. Their hopes of wealth were dashed when they became victims of countless traps of spike-filled pits, rooms with crushing walls, acid that poured from holes in the ceiling, contact poison, and, worst of all, biting curses such as raw diseases, rotting blindness, never-ending nightmares, and so very, very many more dark, belligerent, disgusting horrors. The monograph listed a total of 119 traps and curses, all of them vicious in nature. Doughty, Berwick, and Graben had become words synonymous with both forlorn thoughts and places to be avoided altogether. All of that had been terrible, so dreadfully terrible, but the two little men reflected upon one more fact that had resounded from the monograph: the Lick of that forgotten civilization had finally gathered enough strength to walk among the living. The author of the monograph, his or her name being all but worn off from the cover, had been unable to determine the Licker's original name in life, but in death, the undead creature carried the title of Shaden Morg. I guess we should go pay for this monograph and return the vernacular translator. Brox, still chilled to the bone, did not wish to move and deal with his current situation. Yet, necessity forced him into action. What? Started Thistlethorn. His voice sounded cracked and dried, a byproduct of the terrifying monograph. What do you plan to do? Brox pondered this a moment. If I go back to my burrow, I am sure to be attacked again. If I run anywhere else, I think that in due time I will be found. Therefore, I plan to track down this lick and take the conflict to him. After paying for the monograph and returning the marble statue of the scholar, Brox asked Cavington the beheaded if she had anything on liches. She turned her attention away from the book she had been reading and looked straight at the gnome. First you read a monograph written in the Canon of Fevers and now you want something on liches? This is highly irregular. Perhaps I can interest you in a volume set of 3 books on the history of gnomish magic featuring a large part on illusions. Brox waved her suggestion away. Just something on liches. Surely, you aren't wanting to join the ranks of the undead. It is a terrible condition. Not at all. He started to give her an explanation, but she pulled a second-hand documentary out from under the counter as if she had expected him to ask for some literature on liches. Unlike the monograph, the documentary seemed in reasonably good shape, having only some wear at the edges. How much? A silver noble. Brox dropped a coin made of silver into her hand. The coin's face had 2 dignified-looking judges reading from law books with the inscription, Judge Virtuously. The back of the coin had a picture of Silver Lace Palace and said, Guardian of the. The rest was too worn off to be read. Thank you. She collected the payment. Brox nodded. We appreciate the frangible crumb cakes and carved coffee, your expertise in finding the monograph and documentary, the use of your vernacular translator, and your general hospitality. We take our leave of you and hope to visit your shop someday in the future. She smiled softly. Thither may you make good haste to the realm which pales ever so more in the moon's waning light whilst nightmares press hard upon your travels, always seeking to bring your downfall, as you go to prevail in uncertain ventures and your burdens weigh you down to a dreary epic. Having said that, she turned her attention back to Arcanum Striker, reading the part where the party of 3 made their way through the catacombs, unaware that they were heading toward the dragon's lair. Brox stepped out the shop's door with Thistlethorn in tow. As they walked, Brox explained his plan to Thistlethorn. The shortling recoiled in dismay. Visit a lick? What do you plan to do? Pleasantly pass an afternoon with him while you drink berry budge in your wooden flagon and he drinks a spicy blend of arsenic and cyanide in a stylish decanter of lead? Don't be sarcastic. I'm not sure what I'll do, but waiting for the lick to find me and terrorize me with zombie moths or other undead creatures is something that I cannot abide. Thistlethorn did not like the idea of his friend intentionally seeking out such a formidable undead entity, but he knew that waiting for it to make another move to be a terrible torment of uncertainty. Somehow, continued Brox, the lick feels that I am a threat to him, or else he would not have bothered to send the zombie moths or that unfriendly letter. In the meantime, I am going here. He pointed to a map in the monograph. The map did not look all that special to Thistlethorn, it only showed an array of unnamed mountains, swamps, forests, and rivers with their corresponding oxbow lakes. How are you supposed to know where any of that is? Thistlethorn continued to look at the map. Nothing is labeled. Perhaps. Perhaps not. Brox pointed to a rock structure that appeared to be an irregular heptagon. Look here. That looks like. Thistlethorn's face turned ashen. Demise cleft. He shook his head vehemently. You've got to be mad to go there. The place is crawling with 2-headed ettins, mobs of bugbears, and ether maggots. This later creature lived slightly outside of reality, allowing it to move with ease to its victims. It would burrow itself into the skin of its prey and live as a parasite, slowly killing its quarry, and living off the dead carcass for many weeks thereafter. You will unquestionably die there. Some bugbear posse will hunt you down, or a 2-headed ettin will bash you unconscious with its club, and you will land face first in a swamp bog with the ether maggots having a field day of your flesh. You would be better off returning home. At least they're the lick. Could slay you while you sat comfortably in your rocker in front of a warm fire with a full cheese wheel and fresh baked bread to boot. Brox chortled at the image Thistlethorn conjured. I am inclined to agree with you on that point. He shook his head. However, I only used Demise Cleft as a point of reference. When the scholar spoke, he mentioned a secret route that ran from the west. But there are mountains and an ocean to the west. True. However, I think I can make it via this alternate route. Thistlethorn began to comment on how impractical such a plan was when he noticed that Brox had said I and not we. What do you mean that you are going to go? What am I supposed to do? Go make your funeral plans? Surely you don't expect me to ask you to confront a lick? I am glad that you came with me to Cavington's Emporium. However, my next destination is sure to be a bitter pill. I would not want to impose upon you. Impose? Thistlethorn crossed his arms, glancing at a pair of duck hawks flying high above in the process. When they had flown by, he looked fixedly at the gnome. Need I remind you that when Rotmore the troll was about to bludgeon me to death, it was you who hit him with a flask of oil and then set him ablaze? He took a couple of steps around Brox as he continued. Need I remind you that when the tunnel of the abandoned silver mine collapsed burying me completely, everyone left me for dead except you? You dug me out with your bare hands until your skin was rubbed so raw that muscle and sinew could be seen. He stopped in front of the gnome. Finally, was it not you who pushed me out of harm's way as a trapped treasure chest exploded into a magical ice storm? If I recall correctly, you were so frozen to the bone from the sub-zero temperatures that you could not move for a fortnight due to your injuries. The damage you saved me from was so severe that even the cleric that had tended to you had stated the frostbite might leave Brox lame for the rest of his life. Thistlethorn scoffed and guffawed sarcastically, hooting it up with a little tap. Now we stand here with you suggesting that I go my merry way and you, single-handedly, rush to face some undead lick called the Shaden Morgue. All right. All right. Brox held up his hands in surrender. Not only may you come, but I would be glad for your company on such a perilous endeavor. Good, because it would have been counterproductive if I would have had to hurt you before you left. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. The late afternoon found them walking on a seldom-used trail that led between two farm pastures with horses in one pasture and cows in the other. From time to time they would come across wooden fences that had fallen into decay from neglect, owing to termites or wood rot. Occasionally, a small animal would make its presence known, but none of them paid much attention to the two travelers, except for a bushy-tailed pallid squirrel that Brox took the time to give a couple of acorns to. In time, they made their way past an ancient forest of white pines, universally known as the GW Woods. Like other thick, dense forests, a myriad of foul denizens inhabited this labyrinth of vegetation. Therefore, it was no surprise that people kept their distance from the GW Woods, not wanting to tangle with bands of gnolls, berserk ogres, or greater poison ivy. Contact with the typical poison ivy resulted in a rash, but contact with greater poison ivy resulted in death, or if a person was fortunate, only a coma lasting several days. There was another thing about the GW Woods. The white pines were planted in perfectly straight rows, the base of each tree being 3 full strides away from the base of the next tree. 289 square miles, according to an Imperial survey team, of perfectly lined up trees row after row. This peculiarity remained a complete mystery. The white pines, being 34 centuries old, meant finding the reason behind this would probably never be forthcoming. Many theories had been advanced, including Titans planting an oversized garden, druidic magic gone awry, men with machines growing a tree farm, a treant with a sense of humor, etc. Children and young adults often would make dares to one another to see who would walk the deepest into the forest before being overwhelmed by fear and fleeing. Thistlethorn had once had such an experience. And what did you see? Brox asked his friend about his foray into the GW Woods. Trees, trees, and more trees in such straight lines as to boggle the mind. Also, my companions and I saw some greater poison ivy growing in sparse patches. There were some footprints in the ground. I had no idea what they were, but one of my group said that they belonged to an ogre. Far from there we saw the dusty remains of a skeletal body dressed in rotting leather armor. The only thing that remained reasonably intact was a shield that had a crudely painted crest of a 3-chain flail on it. A dead gnoll from the Casmark clan? Yes. There wasn't much left of him, but that would have been my guess. The oddest part of the escapade into the GW woods was a high-pitched cry from a monster made of metal. I don't think that it was an iron golem, but might have been a variety of it. Most of my group turned and ran. A couple of others and I took up the self-implored challenge to investigate, one of my more vapid decisions in life, since I could have been killed by the monster. We watched it for a moment as it ate a tree or appeared to be eating a tree. It began slowly circling the tree. It wasn't walking around the tree, but it was attached to the tree. It made no attempt to remain quiet, shrieking a most painful shrill. Every once in a while it would come to a full stop and quit its shrieking, making a new soft whirring sound in the process. He paused for a moment. This latter noise was similar to the one that you hear when you turn the crank on your grandfather. Clock to wind it up. He shrugged. Anyhow, its single black eye on a rope thick antennae spotted us. When it did so, it gave chase. We fled at top speed. It moved considerably faster than we did. Since I only glanced back once, I can only haphazardly say that it was flying above the ground but below the canopy of the tree branches. It made a scream, a new one, not like the one it made while eating trees. Something slapped me in the back, causing me to hit the ground with a hard impact. I rolled a good dozen paces beyond the last of the trees of the GW woods and onto this very path that we walk on. To our great fortune, when we all exited the GW woods, the metal monster retreated. It did not even stop to see if we would return. What hit you and sent you to the ground? Thistlethorn shook his head. I don't rightly know. When my shoulder, the point of impact, had been examined, it was found that my tunic and leather armor were burned with a small hole just under half an inch in diameter. About as big as an arrow tip, asked Brox. Indeed. The healer who tended my wound carefully examined it and said it was a burn similar to that of a sunburn, piercing slightly into the flesh. He had made that conclusion based upon the small blisters. Sounds like a fire arrow spell or maybe a firebrand spell, except for the small blisters are out of step for both of those spells. They tend to produce charred skin. I don't know much about magic, so I cannot say what kind of spell it was or even if it was a spell. Thistlethorn shrugged. But there had been one thing special about that trip into the GW woods. I learned to love adventure more than the comforts of the typical shortling home. So, basically stated, it was that foray into the GW woods that changed my way of thinking. The road that they had been walking on turned into a dirt path, dense with crabgrass and split-leaf weed, that wound between towering rows of sagebrush mixed in with poison ivy, the typical, non-lethal variety, that twisted in bulky clumps. They began to discuss ancient history focusing on wars, heraldry, and possible outcomes had certain what IFS had come to pass. The conversation continued to keep them going, laughing, making sarcastic remarks in light humor, and singing tacky traditional songs of both gnome and shortling variety. In the midst of one of these songs, the cry of an attacking griffin split the sky. Griffins are an ancient race of creatures from the old world, being a mix of half eagle and half lion. Their creation by powerful magic, some say a ruined science, has led them to be imposing, vigorous creatures with a vast wingspan. Griffins possess an insatiable desire for horse flesh and their ilk, including unicorns and pagazi. Their bite is dangerous, but even more dangerous are their elongated, sharp talons, which form a vice clamp when they lock onto their prey. At the instant of an attack, griffins let out a high-pitched screech that sounds like an eagle's shriek mixed with a lion's roar. If Brox and Thistlethorn had traveled into the city limits of Derry, they would have quickly noticed well-posted warning messages speaking of a clutch of griffins that had taken residence in the hills just south of the GW woods. Moreover, they would have had ample notice to avoid the very path that they now traversed. Even though 24 imperial archers, with rangers for guides, had sought out the nesting grounds of the griffins, they had only been able to kill 3 of the 7 griffins in the past 8 weeks. Now, one of these dreadful flying monsters had attacked Thistlethorn, planning to make the shortling its next meal. Without time to even think of responding, 2 sets of claws had him in a vice-like grip, jerking him off his feet and pulling him into the air. Thistlethorn had been so stunned by the swiftness of the attack that he did not even cry out in surprise. Brox had been looking at Thistlethorn's face one moment and the soles of his friend's boots the next. Brox did not even have enough time to make a small gesture to help his friend, such as grabbing the griffin's lion tail or casting a minor spell like Unbalance in hopes of making the monster's flight unstable and causing it to drop the shortling. The gnome saw his friend in the clutches of the griffin disappear over the treetops while a few drops of Thistlethorn's blood fell in the wake of their flight. Brox, yelling to his friend, ran into an open field so that he could see the griffin. The creature turned toward its nest in the hills. To Brox's terror, his friend did not even kick or scream, showing no signs of life. Brox watched as they became smaller and smaller in the distant horizon, shrinking to a distant dot and then fading from sight altogether. Brox just stood there. Not moving. Not thinking. Not even being swallowed up in the sorrow that would flood him in due season. Only a numb feeling pervaded through him. He had enough knowledge of griffins to know that Thistlethorn would be torn relentlessly limb from limb and devoured in full. His friend's last few moments would be torment and bitter agony with no recourse of help. He only comforted himself in the realization that the other was already dead. Thistlethorn's limp body gave evidence that he had been slain outright from the griffin's swift attack, perhaps via the claws piercing his heart or lungs. Grief washed over him in several waves. The first wave removed the stunned feeling that he had. The second wave filled him with the pain of the loss of a friend beyond degree. The third hindered his ability to even breathe in a normal fashion. Finally, another wave of guilt rolled over him as he knew that none of this would have happened if Thistlethorn had not been resolved to help him in his time of swelling need. The gnome simply dropped to the ground, having no strength left. The sun had slipped behind the hills of Thistlethorn's resting place when Brox stood back up.